Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast. Today, I have quite a unique guest with me. His name is Ewan, and he managed to travel all the way from Australia to Switzerland via ocean and land. What's surprising about this is that he also managed to travel all the way through Mongolia using a 30-year-old bike. It's quite an exciting story. He has a book out. We'll go ahead and talk about that later on in the show. But without further ado, welcome to the show, Ewan. How are you?
Good, thanks, Tasha. Good to be here.
Glad to have you. Now, what made you decide to travel all the way from Australia to Switzerland without just taking a flight over there?
It was sort of something I'd always wanted to do, not specifically from Australia to Switzerland, but I knew that at the end of uni, I wanted to do some big trip. And then as I was coming to the end of my degree, I sort of thought it'd be good to set a kind of challenge, instead of just doing a circle or going around and wandering around Asia kind of aimlessly. I like the idea of going from A to B. And then it was just really, well, where's A and where's B? A was where I was, which is in Australia, and B was just my parents' place. They live over in Switzerland. So I decided, well, I'll see how far I can get. I wasn't really optimistic that it would work or that I could get all the way there without flying. But I thought I'll see how far I get, and if it comes to it, I can fly. And then it ended up that I never had to.
Now, what was your family and friends? What was their first reaction when they heard you say this? Because in my mind, when I think going from Australia all the way to Switzerland without having to fly there, you're talking about having to traverse all the way across the ocean to Southeast Asia and then all the way across Asia to the west to Europe. And that's a daunting task. I mean, was your family fully on board with this, or was there some apprehension on their end?
Yeah, there was a lot of apprehension. Yeah, a lot of people sort of didn't really believe it. I guess when I first said it, a lot of people were like, "Oh, well, why don't you just fly to Singapore? That'd be a lot easier." Um, my partner Danica was supportive, but also apprehensive, as you'd expect. And to be honest, I didn't really tell my parents the full plan before I started. It was only once I sort of got going and told them that I was going to try and get to their place without flying that they were like, "Oh, okay." So it was kind of after the fact. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So there wasn't much they could do about it at that point. But I tried. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of apprehension from family. I tried to sort of offset that by choosing a route that was sort of safer than the other ones. And this is kind of why I ended up taking the route I did up through Mongolia and through Russia, partly because I really wanted to go to Mongolia, having seen, Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman on Long Way Round when I was like 12. From then on, I was like, I have to go to Mongolia. But aside from that, to get from Australia to Europe, I mean, you couldn't really go through the Middle East for Syria, obviously, and then trying to get through India and Pakistan and then into Iran would have been a big problem because um, well, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan wasn't really possible. Iran, I wasn't sure about. The other side of Iran was difficult. And in any case, further east of India, it's quite difficult to get to India from the east side because the border with Myanmar is closed. So, and then you got the Himalayas. So I could have gone to India and then tried to go up to China, but then Tibet is, closed, and then there's the mountains in the way. So it kind of was the only way to do it, the route I took. So my family knew that I was taking, I guess, the safest route, the only possible route. Um, and I had an emergency beacon on me. So if they didn't hear from the authorities, and they could assume that everything was going okay.
So, was there a lot of planning taking place for this? Because it sounds like you have your whole entire route mapped out for you, but you would assume that if you're backpacking across Europe and Asia, mind you, that it would kind of be go with the flow, fly by the seat of your pants, figure out, where you're going once you cross that bridge. But it sounds like you kind of had a general idea of where you were going to go from the get-go, where you're going to get your gear, and what kind of mediums of travel you were going to use to traverse, across Asia and Europe.
Yeah, I had a rough idea. I mean, I knew the overall route, and this is kind of interesting because this gets into, is it is it worth planning these kind of things at all, or is it worth just kind of winging it all as you go? And before I started this trip, I was a real planner. I like to know as much as possible before I did something, and I didn't deal very well with uncertainty. And this trip was just 6 months of uncertainty. So, but before I left, I like sort of went on the internet and researched everything about each country, and I had a big Word document with all the visa details for each country kind of broken down, and train details between like Thailand to Vietnam, Vietnam to China, and then once I got into China, I assumed I could get the Trans-Siberian up into Russia, and I kind of at the start of the trip had it all planned out. Uh, and as far as gear goes, I mean, I had a few changes of clothes in a pack. I had an iPad Mini and my phone and a little keyboard so I could do some blog posts. But not a whole lot. I carried a tent with me as well, just on the off chance that I thought I'd be camping. I didn't know at that point that I was going to be buying the bike, so it was all sort of improvised from that point of view. But I had the essentials. But then when I started the trip, once I left Australia and got to Singapore and got into Southeast Asia, there was a big kind of learning curve there where you realize that there are many more options available than the ones that you find on the internet. So I'd found, trains from Malaysia up to Bangkok in Thailand, but I got there and ended up taking a load of vans and staying on islands with people and kind of playing it by ear, because there's a lot you don't know until you get there, and you can't really plan for something when you don't have all the information available to you. So I kind of had to learn, I guess, to adapt on the road, because it's more fun that way. You meet people that are going places and you go, oh, I'll come with you. I'll see this. Like, oh, I've heard of this cool, these mountains that are nice. Oh, I hadn't heard of that on the internet, but I'll go with you. And then it turns out that to cross some borders was easier, um, through a way that I didn't previously know, just going on Google, sitting in Sydney. So an example of that is going from Thailand into Myanmar. I had an idea that I would take the train or somehow go through one of the border crossings up north. But then I got there and found out that the southern part of Myanmar, which is down just sort of west of the border with Thailand and down to Malaysia, just on the east side of the Andaman Sea, had only just opened up to foreigners about 2 or 3 years before I was passing through. So I got to Bangkok and found that there was a new route across the mountains, and someone was saying, "Yeah, you can just go to this, take the train to this town, go to the bus stop, and you can ask for a minivan. They'll take you across the border." So I ended up getting this minivan with this random French guy, and we were just sort of went across the mountains in southern Thailand into this part of Myanmar that hadn't really seen tourists. They didn't have power at night, so it was all dark, and the roads and the mountains were blocked by trees, and it was cool. It was unplanned, and that's the sort of thing that I wouldn't have done if I just stuck to the script that I made back in Sydney.
So if you were to, excuse me, if you were going to do this again in the future, would you plan out your trip, or would you kind of just play it by ear and see where the trip takes you? Because it sounds like you had a much better time when you came across unique individuals. You went ahead and traveled to different areas you didn't initially plan on doing, and it became more of an adventure than a straight A to B planned goal.
Yeah, and I still stuck within the rough route that I was always going to take, which was up to Russia and then heading west. But yeah, if I was to do it again, I wouldn't have bothered with all the writing things out and copying and pasting them into a Word document, because it didn't really help in the end. It was more just gain the information while you're there and then make a decision on the spot, which is kind of how the bike happened when I got to Mongolia. It was, I got to Ulaanbaatar, realized that if I took the train to Russia, I wouldn't get to see Mongolia, because you just get on the train and, I mean, 6 hours later you're in Russia. So I was looking around going, well, what other options are there? And the two options were, the three options were to somehow find a lift across the country. But the problem with that is then you're just going very set routes. And you could be waiting up to a week for a van. Uh, the other option was to buy a horse. I mean, it kind of sounds kind of strange, but it's quite popular in Mongolia. Obviously, everyone gets around on horses. So that was the choice. But for me, was between buying a horse and buying a bike. And I don't have much experience with horses, but there was a bike for sale, so I ended up going for the bike. But that was a decision that I could never have planned for, and it was good in the moment to have reached a point, I guess, where I was able to adapt, and the fear of uncertainty was gone. I think because I'd been dealing with uncertainty by that point for about 4 or 5 months. Have you ever seen Tasha? Have you ever seen The Martian?
The Martian, yes, it's the movie in which
It's got Matt Damon. Yeah, he gets stuck on
Matt
Mars.
Damon, yes, he goes to Mars and he gets stuck on there, and they have to go ahead and rescue them. It's a fantastic movie. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, wasn't stuck on Mars, but his approach to that was very much like one thing at a time, and you can't like he couldn't have planned the whole escape, and you couldn't have planned how he was going to deal with everything as it came up because he didn't have the information. Um, but as things presented themselves, he adapted and kind of went with it, and that ended up. I guess that mentality was sort of forced on me, and I'm glad it was because in the end, it ended up being a lot more interesting than if I'd followed a script.
Now, were there any specific situations that you were entirely unplanned for, whether it was coming across someone who's bribing you, or holding you up for money, or holding you at the border so you couldn't get across? Is that some situation that you faced commonly, or is it just a standard adventure without any adversity, so to speak?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was standard. I mean, there were times where I thought I probably could have put a bit more planning into this. A good example of that, I was in Beijing, and I went to the Mongolian embassy when I got there to get the visa. I wasn't going to be able to get the visa for a week, so I sort of had this unplanned week in Beijing. And I decided, all right, well, on the weekend, I'm going to go up to the Great Wall of China. And I did a bit of reading on my phone, and I found that there was a part of the wall that you could go to and you could walk along, and it was quite wild and unpatrolled, and that sounded quite cool. I was like, all right, that sounds nice. So I'll go up over the weekend and hike that stretch of wall and come back. I thought it would take a day. So I bought I bought a bottle of water. Um, I went to the supermarket. I bought some Oreos, bought a thing of honey, and I thought when I get closer to the wall, I'll get a loaf of bread, and that should tie me over for the day. Honey, bread, Oreos. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but I mean, it was a small Chinese supermarket in Beijing. There wasn't like heaps I could get that was fresh that would last. So I got the bus, got a train, got a bus, ended up in this random village with one guy and a donkey. And I was sort of thinking, like, this trip was on Lonely Planet. And I was like, okay, this is a lot more sort of remote than I thought it was going to be. So I was walking around the village looking for somewhere to buy a loaf of bread, and there wasn't anywhere. There wasn't even anywhere to get water or anything. So I just kind of had my little like 2 liters or something, and then I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to have to, I don't know, eat the Oreos or just see how this goes. So I walked up to the wall, um, and it was a lot more challenging of a walk than Lonely Planet kind of led me to believe. There were parts where the wall was like going up a steep hillside and had sort of crumbled away. So it was essentially just like a vertical rock face. And I had a pack on my back that was about 12 to 15 kilos. And I wasn't prepared to be climbing vertically upwards, but sort of ended up having to do it and wasn't really in the right shoes, didn't have any gear, didn't have a sleeping bag, just had a tent. I was wearing shorts, a t-shirt, and this kind of thin green raincoat. So I walked along for a while and then was taking a lot longer than I thought. And the night came in and I had to like sort of shelter in this watchtower. And the where I was like at the top of a slope, like it was at the peak of the mountain. So the wind would um, run up the slope on one side and through the watchtower and down the other side of the mountain. So I was kind of like basically trying to sleep in a wind tunnel and in shorts and a t-shirt. So I was freezing, shivering, and I was just trying to like drink the honey out of this jar and eat these Oreos. And I was thinking, God, yeah, a lot more planning could have gone into this. This was not a great idea. My shoes weren't walking shoes. They were just like flat soled shoes that I'd bought for a few dollars. So my feet were like blistered at the back and were bleeding and my knees hurt and I was cold. And I was thinking, yeah, this in this example, I could have probably put a bit more thought into it and had a much better time. But funnily, actually, when I was walking on that bit of the wall, I was walking along these two guys. tourists as well were sort of running up behind me. And they ran up to me and they were breathless and they had nothing. They were just in, yeah, like me, shorts, t-shirt, and they had joggers. And I was like, oh, where are you from? They were from New Zealand. And I was like, why are you running along the wall? And they were like, well, we did what you did. Like we read the Lonely Planet thing. And then we got here and realized it was so much further to get to back to civilization than we thought. And we don't have anything on us. So we just
Wow.
decided that we were going to run the whole way. So, I mean, these guys are like kind of like me, but instead of hunkering down for the night, they just decided to sprint for, I don't know, 15 kilometers or whatever it was. So, look, I wasn't the only one, but yeah, that when I was sort of shivering up the top of the wall in the middle of the night, I was thinking, yeah, I probably could have planned this better. At least bought a sleeping
And
bag.
yeah, and that wall goes on for miles and miles, doesn't it? It just covers the border, a part of Asia, north to
Yeah,
south, I
yeah,
thought.
yeah. It's huge. It goes. I mean, I'm not. Uh, I don't know the whole length, but from what I've understand, it goes from basically almost the border with North Korea out towards Kazakhstan, and different parts of it are. Some parts are crumbled and no longer visible. Some parts were kind of pulled apart for stone. Some parts are really well maintained, which is where I ended up at a part of the wall that's very well looked after. And then other parts, like where I was, are kind of like some bits of wall that are really um, like have stood the test of time and haven't crumbled, and then other parts that are gone. So there's one part where I was walking along the wall, and it kind of crested a hill and came down and entered this forest, and the wall disappeared. And I was going, like, where'd it go? I just thought I'd basically just follow the ridge of the hill, and it should pop back up again. So I was sort of walking along and found this hole in the ground. It was just like a dark circle, a dark square, and I could kind of see underneath it that there was some kind of stone room. So I thought, okay, well, this must be the wall. This must be a guardhouse that's, I don't know, sunken into the ground or been reclaimed by the forest. So I had to drop my pack into it and then jump in. And I jumped in there, and this cat was in there, and it like skirted behind a corner, and I actually nearly shit myself. I thought it was like some, I don't know, some human in there like waiting for people like me that just drop into his hole. Um, but yeah, no, it's really good. I'd really recommend it. Anybody that's in China should definitely go and have a look. The scale of it is just, it's just enormous. I mean, you can see photos of it online, but when you're standing at the top of a mountain looking at a wall that stretches to the horizon without taking any shortcuts, it's going across all the mountain ridges. It's, yeah, it's pretty crazy.
And it sounds like such an expansive journey. What boggles my mind when it comes to this, though, is that how many countries you've traveled through from the beginning to end, going from Australia, I'm assuming by ship, to Southeast Asia, and then having to traverse through all these different countries. What sounds pretty tenuous about that is having to communicate with people from different cultures, different language barriers, and social norms. Did you find it easy for yourself to navigate across all of these countries? And was it easy for you to find help when it came to finding a ride from one end of the country to the other, and so on and so forth? Or was it a
Yeah.
challenge for you?
Well, some countries are a lot easier in terms of the language stuff than others. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. I mean, there's a lot of tourists. There's a lot of backpackers. So English is fairly well understood. And even if they don't speak English, they can get a general idea of what you're after because people are asking all the time. Countries that are a bit more difficult, Myanmar, particularly in the south where I first entered the country, um, they still speak English there, but I mean, a lot of people are sort of on the train, and that didn't really. But you can get a surprising amount of information across with hand gestures. And short of that, you can always sort of point to things, point to menus. For example, if you're in the train station, you can point to destinations. A lot of Southeast Asian alphabets are quite similar to English, so you're not illiterate. You can read boards and you can kind of read the characters and work out where you're going. Where that really changed was China, coming into China from Vietnam, because everything's obviously in Chinese script. So suddenly, for the first time the whole trip, really, I was functionally illiterate. I was at the train station trying to find a train to Guangzhou and couldn't even read Guangzhou on the train thing. It was actually quite insight. It was interesting because it's the first time in my life that I haven't been able to read something, and it kind of makes you think like actually not being able to read would be incredibly difficult. I mean, obviously everybody knows that, but when you actually experience it and you're in China and you can't read a thing, and all the characters look like a guy putting a book into a microwave, and you're like, I don't know what that means. Does that mean Guangzhou? I can't tell. But people are so helpful, and there's people that speak English, so you sort of standing around looking lost, and people just came up to me and they're like, "Oh, can we give you a hand?" Um, I speak a bit of English, and I was like, "Oh, that's so helpful." So on the train into China, I met there were these two girls that were sharing my cabin, and they were going back. They'd just been on holiday in Vietnam, and they were going back to their university. And they were asking me all about the trip, and they were going, "Oh, so do you speak any Chinese?" I'm like, "No, I don't. Sorry, I don't read any Chinese." So in my note, I had a little notebook with me. They wrote uh, all the destinations that I thought I'd be going. They wrote a few questions like, "How do I get to Beijing? How do I get to Guangzhou?" In Chinese script, and then they also gave me like the English alphabet translation, so I could sort of wing it that way. And then when I got to the train station, was looking for like the ticket counter, for example, and someone would come up to me and go like, "Can I help you?" And I'd show them my notebook and be like, "I'm trying to go to Guangzhou," and they'd go, "Oh, the ticket counter's over here." They'd lead me, put me in line. I mean, I kind of felt like a kid, but it was yeah, it was good. You think the language barrier is big, and it is big, and you can't talk about complicated topics, but you get a lot across, and people are really helpful and really willing to help out.
And it sounds pretty mind opening to be put into a different culture, a different country where you're kind of out of your element. I mean, for myself, I haven't personally experienced traveling to Southeast Asia, but I've traveled to other countries in which you don't really understand the language. You can't really read what's on the sign, but you'll notice that people tend to be fairly friendly when it comes to helping you navigate or get to a certain place, or even just to find a menu, find a hotel to stay out, things like that. And it's pretty mind opening to see, because we're so used to living in our bubble within our space. We're so used to seeing the English language, so used to being able to communicate freely. But when we're outside of our element, things seem so much more daunting. And we kind of underestimate the general kindness of people we've never met before and cultures we've never immersed ourselves in. So it's cool to see that a backpacker can travel through all of these different countries and still find it easy or somewhat easy to navigate through them without feeling completely lost out of their mind, and feeling kind of stuck and alone throughout the
Oh
whole
yeah,
thing.
I mean, there's just thousands of people doing it. I guess my story kind of seems a bit unusual because I strung together a lot of different countries, but in each of those countries, there'd be so many people backpacking around, and some would travel similar routes to what I did. Um, but I guess, yeah, comparatively few went Southeast Asia, China, Russia, Europe all in one go. But in each of those countries, there was always people around. And it's not to say, there were a lot of times that the language barrier was quite difficult, uh, and a lot of times I would end up confused and not sure what I did wrong. Examples of that, like sometimes I'd walk into, especially Mongolia, walk into places that I thought were a restaurant, and it would look exactly like a restaurant. It had like a Coca-Cola sign out the front. I'd get in, there'd be like tables and chairs, there'd be a menu, and I'd sit down and like point it, and they would come out and go, not speak English, but sort of insinuate, "Oh, what can I get for you?" And I'd point at something on the menu, and they would just shake their head, and I'd be like, "Okay." And I'm pointing the next thing on the menu, and they'd shake their head again, and then disappear, and then someone else would come back and shake their head, and then I would end up just having to leave because the communication barrier was just too much. Um, and then, yeah, there was a few times that sort of happened where you'd think like, I don't know, I sort of got the feeling that I'm communicating what I want, or I guess I think I am quite clearly, and I'm not sure where it's getting lost. But who knows? It could not have been a restaurant. It could have been like a bingo club or something. I've got no idea. And when I was pointing at the menu, I could have been pointing at the sign that says entrees or mains, not like an actual dish. And so they probably, gone home and thought, yeah, who's this crazy guy that's come into my bingo club and pointed at the sign for, I don't know, whatever. So it's hard to know. And in those situations, you just kind of got to accept that you're not going to get past it and just leave. And you haven't lost anything for that. And if you're not rude, you're not impolite, you've tried your best and you've respected local customs as much as you can, and it's still not working, then you just try somewhere else. You don't need to get frustrated or anything. It's kind of how it is. But a lot of overcoming the language barrier and finding people that are helpful, you could go through two or three people where it's sort of a dead end before you find someone that's able to help you. And it's not that anybody wasn't willing. It's just that sometimes, yeah, the language barrier is too much, but it doesn't stop anybody.
Sounds like a really humbling experience, honestly. And even despite being out of your element, you kind of persevere through that, regardless if a lot of the communication got lost in translation. I mean, you're using a combination of sign language, pointing, seeking out help from others. And, of course, a lot of that can be misinterpreted, but it sounds like despite all of that, you were able to still navigate around and get food, find a ticket to wherever you were going, and so on and so forth. So, despite all those adversities and challenges that you face, you're still able to come through the other end. Uh, that said, I kind of want to circle back to the beginning of the trip just to understand how did you kind of navigate from Australia all the way to Basel, Switzerland? What was your, predestined route to get there? And what was the journey like?
Um, so Australia, I mean, the most difficult, I mean, we're talking before about planning. The hardest thing to plan was how to leave Australia because not many people try and do that without an aeroplane. So that took several months of trying to find. I mean, I was trying to find boats to Indonesia. I was trying to find like crew positions on yachts. There's websites where you can sort of sign up, and if someone wants a yacht moved from A to B, you can go along and sort of provide free labor in exchange for passage. So I was trying to do that kind of thing, but they're very sort of few and far between. Um, a lot of people from Australia that had yachts would be taking them east to New Zealand or down to Tasmania or sort of into the South Pacific. They weren't going up to Indonesia, partly because the waters around there are a lot less safe. So after a few months, I found this cruise and then thought, oh, well, that's it. That's the only way to do it. And that was leaving from Perth. So that kind of set, okay, well, now I have to get to Perth. Um, and the way to do that was through train. So that kind of laid itself out for me well ahead of time, how to cross Australia and get to Singapore. So I took trains. I drove down to Melbourne, and then I got a bus and a train connection to Adelaide, and then I got a train, the Indian Pacific across the desert over to Perth, and then got on the boat and got that to Singapore. And the boat stopped in Bali, and it stopped in Phuket and a few other places in Southeast Asia before it got to Singapore. And then, yeah, like I was saying before, from Singapore, it was kind of a question of, do you take the route through India and the Middle East to Europe, or do you go north? And like I was saying before, there's a couple of borders that are very difficult. Crossing to India from Myanmar isn't possible. Crossing from India into Tibet is very difficult. Going from Pakistan to Afghanistan is very dangerous. Going into Iran and then into Turkey is possible, but then you're sort of skirting Syria, and it wasn't really a risk I was willing to take. So the only route was into China. And then in China, it was a question of north to Russia or west out to Central Asia, sort of Kazakhstan. And the whole reason, I mean, one of the things I really wanted to do on this trip was go to Mongolia. So that going west to Central Asia wasn't really an option for me. I really wanted to get to Mongolia and have a look around. I was just kind of had a bit of an obsession with that. So then it was, okay, once I'm in Mongolia, how do I get around? And then, like I said before, it was either a horse or a bike, and I bought the bike. And then initially I just was going to ride it across Mongolia and then sell it in the west in a town called Bainolgi, which is just out by the Russian border. And then I was going to sort of wing my way to Novosibirsk and then get the train to Moscow and then on through Europe. But when I got to Bainolgi, and this is something I talk about in the book, again, this is kind of one of those things where you get there and the information presents itself, and then whatever plan you had kind of goes out the window. It's like Mike Tyson, right? He said something like, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Well, I got to Bainolgi and realized I couldn't really sell the bike I mean, I could have, but it would have taken quite a long time. My visa was running out. I had a month in Mongolia and I was down to my last 5 days. So I would have had to sell it for virtually no money. And then I was still faced with the problem of finding a way across the Russian border and then getting into Russia. And by this point, I'd kind of developed a bit of an attachment to the bike. I called it Noddy. And for all he broke down, he was a loyal bike. He got me across the country. And um, yeah, I guess because I'd spent so much time alone, I was kind of getting fond of him. So I thought, "Oh, I'm not going to sell him now. It feels like too early to end this relationship." So I stuck with the bike. And then when you take a vehicle into Russia, you have to take it back out again. They check it at the opposite border. So now I have to get Noddy across Russia. Got him into the EU, and then it was kind of, well, I'm not going to sell him in Latvia. I may as well just ride him home. It's only another 5 days or so. So it kind of laid itself out in a lot of ways, the route and the way I ended up going. And each place I got to kind of made the next destination more obvious. Understanding, I guess, the bigger picture was that I didn't want to go to the Middle East and I wanted to go to Mongolia. So it was always going to be set from that point of view.
So, a big focus point of your travels, you mentioned your story on Reddit. You, of course, wrote a book on it, but a big focus of it was traversing through Mongolia. And even more so, the fact that you purchased a motorcycle to ride across the country into Europe and hopefully ultimately into Switzerland. Can we walk through that story of how you came to find the bike and what it was like to have to take care of it, knowing that you were traveling through a mostly sparing country? It was pretty much devoid of, any towns for hundreds of miles, it seems like, across Mongolia. So, what was it like having to purchase the bike, maintenance it, and have to traverse long distances without any tools or extra fuel to get you where you're going?
Yeah, I mean, your last sentence is kind of where I think I probably should have put a bit more planning into that. But yeah, so what happened was I got the train, or bus, and the train, and a few other things to get up to Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, the capital. Uh, and I got there and found this hostel, and I was like, okay, right, how do you do Mongolia? How does anybody see this country? And a lot of people kind of get to Ulaanbaatar on the Trans-Siberian, and they'll book a tour that kind of goes around the steppe, the grasslands in and around Ulaanbaatar, or they might get a tour out to the Gobi Desert in the south, um, or up north. But mostly it's arranged. It's through this like these pre-organized tours, and I didn't really have the budget for that. Um, I mean, I did, but I sort of didn't really want that. I think I wanted something a bit more organic. And then, yeah, it's kind of hard to think back on, but I guess I sort of wanted a bit more of an adventure, really. I wanted to make my own way around Mongolia independently because I'd been moving independently up until that point. So I was in Ulaanbaatar and I was going, okay, how do I need to find something that can take me around, whether it's a horse or a bike? The horse idea kind of quickly died because I didn't know where to find a horse. I don't know how to ride horses. Yeah, you're not getting very far on a horse. I was thinking, well, the advantage is, horses can eat grass, so the horse could just eat. Like, I don't have to refuel it. Um, but yeah, super slow. And I ended up kind of wandering around, and I went to the black market, which is it's called Narantul. It's a big open air market in Ulaanbaatar. It's massive. You can buy anything there. You could buy all the stuff for horses, saddles, shoes. You can buy those gur tents, those big white gur tents. You could buy all the parts for that. You could buy clothing. You can get guns. You can get drugs. I mean, like whatever you want, you can pretty much get it in Narantul. So I was walking around there thinking, okay, if there's motorcycles or any kind of vehicle that I could buy, it's going to be around here. Um, and ended up at the end of the day feeling really frustrated because I just couldn't find anything. And I was starting to think, I'm going to have to do one of these tours. I'm going to have to get the train. And the whole point of coming to Mongolia, kind of, for the country felt like it was slipping away from me. I walked out the front of the market and got in a cab. Uh, and this guy was sitting in the front of the cab, and he turns around and he goes, "Oh, where are you going?" And I was going back to Genghis Khan Square. And he introduced himself. His name was Barter. And he was like, what are you doing here? I was like, I'm trying to get uh, back to Europe. I was hoping to buy a motorcycle. And he was like, okay, like I can help you out. So he kind of gave me the rundown. He said, look, here are your basic options in Mongolia. You could try and get public transport. That's going to be very difficult because they only leave when they're full. You could be waiting a week and then you can only go to like 1 or 2 towns. So he's like, or you could come on a tour with us. If you really want, we can try and find you a horse, or you can go to the KTM store down by the train station and find a bike. They sell used bikes there. So he was super helpful. So I got his number and then went to the KTM store the next day. Um, and a guy there called Ganter, he spoke English and he was amazing. He was like, these are all the bikes we have. This is what you can buy. If you buy this bike, I can help you sort out, all the paperwork, the transit license, getting it registered in your name. We can modify the bike slightly to put a rack on the back so you can strap all your stuff to it. And then Barter, I texted Barter and said, I found this bike. He's like, okay, well, come back to the black market and I'll take you around and we'll get you all the stuff you need. So like shoes, a jacket. His wife owned a stall there. So I ended up sort of hanging out with him at the stall and I bought the shoes and all the kind of helmet and accessories that I'd need for the bike. And Ganja helped me sort of get all the paperwork sorted. So it kind of all, it all just kind of happened. And it was all because I got in a cab at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon or whatever it was. And I just happened to get in a cab with the right person. If I hadn't gotten that cab, I don't know what would have happened. And if I might have found the KTM store, and if I found it and Ganta wasn't working and someone else who didn't speak English was, then again, I could have ended up taking the train. So it was kind of all improvised from that point of view. And then once you start something like that, the easiest, when you encounter a problem, so I got on the bike and it was very much one thing at a time, right? Thinking back to The Martian, one problem presents itself, you solve that problem, and then you solve enough problems and eventually you get home. I rode the bike out of Ulaanbaatar and on the first day took a several 100-kilometer detour that I shouldn't have taken because the maps, this is how I learned that Google Maps isn't accurate in Mongolia. So I kind of went down this motorway for ages and then turned off it to go north on this route that on Google Maps was like this nice thick line. I thought, okay, it's got to be a highway. I turned off and it was rocky. I'd never ridden a bike off road before. I wasn't confident in my abilities there. The odometer on the bike was broken, so I couldn't tell how much fuel I had left. It was kind of guesswork on that front. I didn't know how much fuel, like whether there were fuel stations on the way up on the route that I was planning to take. There was sort of too many uncertainties, so I ended up having to turn around, ride 4 hours back to Ulaanbaatar, and then take the northern route. And then on the first night, the bike fell over. I parked it on a hill on the step, and it fell over, and the clutch handle snapped, and I couldn't move anywhere. So that was a pretty demoralizing evening. And when I put the bike up and it fell over because I was on the side of a hill and I'd ridden a bike before, but this is where my lack of experience is really coming through. And I just kind of thought, all these problems they felt insurmountable in the moment. So I was like, okay, stuff it. I pitched my tent and just got in my tent and listened to the Hamish and Andy Show podcast and just stared at the ceiling, the roof of the tent, which is about 3 inches above my nose. And the wind was like rattling the fabric and the bike was broken. I didn't know where I was. I was immobile and I was just like, okay, maybe this was too much. Maybe I should have taken the train. I don't know how to ride a bike off road. I can't fix a bike. All I had on me was I think I had a pair of pliers and some duct tape. I don't even have the equipment I need. Like, this is crazy. And if the bike was to fall on me, or if I was to come off and get knocked unconscious, this could kill me. And that was a bit of a sobering thought as I lay in that tent, thinking maybe I should just go back to Ulaanbaatar and give up. And then I fell asleep, and in the night was some howling around and some sniffing, and I was just lying there terrified that these wolves were going to come through my tent. And then woke up the next morning and I unzipped the flap, and there were these horses standing right outside the tent in this real soft morning light, when the sun's just come up and it's like that real gentle morning light. And I thought, okay, that looks nice. I don't know. It was a small thing, but it was a morale booster. So I was like, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is have a coffee. I didn't have any plan. I didn't know how I was going to fix the bike. I didn't have the equipment to fix the bike. I was like, I'm just going to make a coffee and that will make me feel better. And then I'll solve the next problem. And as I was making the coffee, this guy came over the hill on a motorcycle and just kind of came up to me and had this look on his face like, "The hell are you doing here?" And I was like, "That's a very good question."
Right place, right time.
Yeah, exactly. And he didn't speak English, but I showed him the clutch handle, and he looked at it and didn't say anything, and then just rode off again. And I was like, "Okay, well, we'll see what happens. I'll just finish my coffee." So I finished my coffee. I was starting to pack up my tent, and he came back with a guy in a ute, a pickup truck. And this guy spoke English, and he was like, "Oh, your clutch handle snapped." And I was like, "Yeah, I need to fix it." He's like, "Okay, well, I own a camp just a couple kilometers away. We'll go back to the camp. We'll get some stuff. We'll bring your bike, and we'll sort it out." So he
Did you all hesitate when it happened, thinking you're gonna get murdered or something?
No, honestly, at that point, I just didn't care. I was like, "Yeah, sure, man. Like, even if even if you take me back to your camp and murder me, I mean, better than getting trapped under a bike and dying of thirst. So whatever." So I got on. He'd actually come on a motorcycle. So he put me on the back of his bike, took me back to his camp. Then we got the pickup, brought the pickup back to the bike. He brought the bike back. He fixed the bike, and he had a few gears. So he put me up in one of his tents. Gave me breakfast and a hot coffee. I got to dry my socks and shoes, which are soaking wet. Um, so within about 3 hours, my life had kind of gone from the pits to just the height of luxury. And this guy fixed my clutch handle and gave me a good route forward. So a lot of situations that I encountered, the question was asking, how do you get over those adversities? Well, you kind of don't really have a choice, and things kind of have a way of happening. As long as you don't just lie down and curl up in a ball, you can find a way to fix it. And that way is generally always asking for someone else's help. And in that sense, I did feel a bit guilty because I was imposing a lot on people just purely by virtue of my own lack of planning and recklessness in some ways. But it ended up working out, um, and they were happy to help.
Did you ever feel like figuring out a solution yourself as opposed to asking other people for help just due to the fear of imposing on them? Or did you find yourself in such a position of desperateness where you felt like, okay, I'm on this bike, the clutch is broken, I don't have any other choice but to reach out to somebody else for help because I'm in a foreign country and I have no idea where I am or where exactly I should be going. So you kind of put yourself in a situation of, I have to, reach out to others for help. And that should be considered okay. You're in a foreign country, you're out of your element. It's difficult to say that you're imposing on others when you're in a situation that is in some ways out of your control.
Yeah, although in some ways still in my control, and that I did buy the bike and kind of got myself in that situation. But yeah, it's not that people would help me because I would approach them and ask in Mongolia. It was more that they saw me and would come up and offer help. In fact, thinking back to it, none of the occasions where was helped along by people in regards to the bike in Mongolia was because I went up to them and I was like, "Can you help me? My bike is broken." It was that they saw me trying to fix it and just saw that I was totally incompetent and would walk up and kind of fix it themselves. For example, the next day um, after I did that, well, the guy fixed my clutch. I got going again, and I got to this town, and the bike. I stopped outside the supermarket to pick up some food, and the bike wouldn't turn back on. And I was going, "Oh, great, another problem." So I was kind of out the front trying to um, start the engine and trying to roll the bike along. And this guy came up to me and just sat on the bike, rolled it down a hill, and force started it, and came back to me and pointed to the other side of town. So I kind of rode in the direction he pointed and saw a mechanic. So he saw me and saw that I was completely inept, and then came up and helped me. So yeah, the fear of imposing wasn't really there because people there never made me feel as if I was imposing. They were so willing to help and so generous with their time and their effort.
Mhm.
Um, that yeah, that wasn't really a problem.
And you know what stands out from what you said? It's that people saw you attempting to solve the problem. They didn't see you just standing around looking at the ground, not really sure what to do. They saw you in some of these instances at least take the effort to try to fix your bike. Otherwise, they wouldn't have understood exactly what you were doing. So it's pretty cool to see that when you put forth the effort to kind of get the ball rolling, people will take note of that and come to your aid when they see that, maybe you don't fully understand how to maintenance a bike or how to fix a broken clutch or how to kickstart the bike when it's not working at that time. So it's fascinating to see that despite, again, the communication barriers, they're willing to come over and help you because they know you're struggling. So that kind of stood out for me.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that's not something I'd really thought about too much. But in all these different countries, if you, no matter where you are, anywhere in the world, really, I suppose if you've made an effort to learn a bit of the language, get some things written on some paper for you, and you're willing to put in a bit of effort, then people will help you out. When I stayed with, so after that in Mongolia, I went to this town and found a way to go and stay up with these reindeer herders that live up near the border with Russia. And I went, and they lived in these teepees in the forest, which they call orts. And they didn't speak a word of English, and they didn't speak much Mongolian either. They speak their own language. So the little Mongolian I knew wasn't very helpful. But they, in that instance, I tried helping around the camp a little bit. So they chopped a tree down and needed to move it from one place to another. So I helped with that, and then helped them split the logs. And when they brought the reindeer back, would help them tie them to trees. And yeah, I think that went a long way. I was criticized at the time because I didn't have a translator with me, and a lot of people that go and stay with the Sartan bring a translator. And in some ways, I probably should have, but in other ways, I'm glad I didn't, because it was more organic that way. And even though we couldn't, what I mean, we couldn't talk, but we could still interact and we could still communicate in our
Hmm.
own way. And yeah, that was valuable.
Yeah, but I mean, you're not going to carry a translator on the back of your bike all the way there.
Oh no, so for that, I left the bike in the town and got a those like old Russian vans that look like a bread loaf. I got in one of those that took me to another town, and then it was arranged to a charity. So then I met the herders who took me on their reindeer up to their camp. So that wasn't on the bike. And there are the ways of arranging translators, but the person that I used to contact the charity and then go up and meet the herders uh, didn't offer a translator at any point. And at the time, I wasn't aware that I should be looking for one, or that it was an option. Um, but yeah, when I was up there staying with them, the group of tourists came in on horses, and they had a translator with them, and we all sat in the orts. I'd been there a couple of days at that point, so I was quite familiar with the family. So these guys came in, and then we all sat in the orts, and they asked a few questions through the translator. It was things like the floor of the orts is sticks that they cut and laid out like floorboards, and they would be like, "Did you cut all these sticks yourself?" And the Zartan would be like, "Yes, yes, we did." And then they'd ask another question, and it was, I mean, they got information out of it, but it was forced. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like when I was talking to the guy Magsa, who was um, the man in the family that I was staying with, even just through hand gestures and drawings, and that I sort of came to understand that in the summer, his wife and his daughters would stay near the town while his daughters went to school, and his sons would sort of help him with the reindeer. And then in winter, he would leave them with his son and go about 300 kilometers north to follow the moss, because the reindeer eat moss and the moss is seasonal. And then he would come back at the end of winter, and one of his sons was the one that he was sort of training to um, take over the herd. So you can get a lot of information. That was just all by hand gestures and kind of a few words that I picked up that they taught me some of their language, and you pick things up quite quickly. So yeah, the effort, I guess, this is a long way of saying that a bit of effort goes a long way, and people are they're very friendly and willing to help out if you're willing to meet them halfway.
Hmm. Now, one of the interesting things that I've noticed when reading your general story was that you watched Justin Bieber on a TV in someone's teepee,
Oh yeah.
and you came across Russian scientists while in Mongolia. What was the story of that?
So the TV, the the reindeer herders that I stayed with in their orts, in their teepees, I mean, they didn't live like a primitive life. They had motorcycles, they had chainsaws, and they had a satellite dish. So they sold. They would carve up little um, old antlers that had fallen off the reindeer. They would carve them into little shapes, and they'd sell them in town for cash here and there. And they got cash as well through people like me who stayed with them through the charity. So they had access to some money, and they spent that on, well, a TV and they had a satellite phone. And yeah, the TV. One night we were in there watching TV, and there was Justin Bieber on MTV or something. And the other person was Mitt Romney, was giving a press conference and like popped up on TV. So I was like in this TP somewhere in Mongolia watching Mitt Romney and Justin Bieber. It was pretty
How
weird.
strange
Yeah, it was.
must
Yeah,
that
that
be,
was pretty
though?
weird. Yeah, but then it kind of like shows you, a lot of this conversation we've been talking about countries and like you go into one country in one language, another country another language. Borders are very arbitrary. You cross one and it's not all that much different, really. People are very similar,
Hmm.
and languages change. In some countries, like going to China was quite different to Vietnam, but it still feels very arbitrary when you cross the border crossing and you're just 20 meters down the road and suddenly you're in a different country, different language. It doesn't feel that different. And even someone that lives in a teepee in northern Mongolia, they're watching Justin Bieber on TV. We're all quite a lot more connected than it might seem. The Russian scientists, and the story with that was after I left Bayanolgi in the west of Mongolia and rode up to Russia, I got to the border and the border crossing was closed. It was closed on weekends. So there was only one place in town to stay. So I rode my bike there, and this couple was sitting in the kitchen. They must have been in their 30s, I think. And he spoke a little bit of English. His name was Sasha, and his wife, Eleanor, spoke some English as well. And he works for the WWF now, but I can't remember who he was working for at the time. But they were both scientists, and they studied snow leopards. So they were in Mongolia to track snow leopards. They leave cameras up in the mountains and see
Wow.
where the snow leopards are going. And then every so often they'd go and collect all the cameras and kind of document population numbers and look at the footage and all that kind of stuff. So he's always in Mongolia. So yeah, I ran into them at the border and they were like, "Oh, what are you doing? What's your plan?" I was going to go to Novosibirsk. Turns out they lived in Novosibirsk. Uh, and they said, "Okay, well, when you get there, give us a call." He gave me his number, and you can come and stay with us, and we'll meet you there. So we had the weekend together. We went on some walks, and a load of trucks piled up at the border, and all the truck drivers and everybody in the town was just like drunk by 11 a.m. every day. There was not a lot to do there, and they all just so wasted. So we're basically the only three people in town that weren't drunk. I mean, even the woman that ran the place I was staying was wasted by 12. So we kind of bonded in that sense. And then Sasha helped me get across the border, helped me fill out all the paperwork, helped me navigate all that stuff. And then he was like, "Okay, yeah, call me when you get to Novosibirsk." So I did, and ended up staying with him. And he had a job interview in Moscow for the World Wildlife Fund, which is where he works now. So he said, "Look," when I got to Novosibirsk, he was like, "How was your ride?" And I was like, "It was really slow. The bike only did about 50 or 60 kilometers an hour at best. I'm not sure what that is in miles, 30 or 40. So it took me hours and hours and hours." And he said, "If you ride to Moscow, you are going to be bored out of your mind. Like it's 3,000 kilometers and you're doing 50 Ks an hour, 60 at best." He's like, "Why don't you put it in the back of my truck? And if you help me move some of my brother's stuff to Samara, which is another city in the south of Russia, we can then go into Moscow and I can leave you there." So that's how that happened. I stayed with them in their apartment. It was a very small apartment. They had a newborn baby. They since had another baby. So they only had two rooms. So they had me in the kitchen and they slept in the living room with their baby in the small apartment out in the suburbs of Novosibirsk. Um, and you're just super generous. I can't really overstate how generous Sasha and Eleanor were in hosting me and I mean driving me to Moscow, and they took me to see Sasha's mum who owned a dacha, and I helped out in their garden picking berries. And one day they took me out to an old disused quarry where they'd been filled in with water, and we took their son Yaroslav out swimming there. Yeah, so that's how that happened. They took me on tours of their university, all that kind of stuff. So that's how I met them. And yeah, they were an absolute lifesaver because if it wasn't for them, I probably would have ditched the bike in Novosibirsk.
You see, it's crazy to hear that, if you just say yes or you just meet somebody and spark up a conversation, where that could lead to. I mean, you're crossing Mongolia, you come across a Russian scientist, his family, and you manage to get all the way to Moscow with the help of this individual. You spend time with this family, and your adventure takes a turn. And in
Mm.
many cases, it
Yeah.
could be for the worse, but in some cases, it could be for the better. And it makes that adventure altogether much more enjoyable because you're not just following again, like I said earlier, a straight A to B path, but you're kind of going through these ebbs and flows and making your own path, and it becomes much more enjoyable when you do that based off the story you're telling me.
Yeah. And there were times that I said yes and it got me in a pickle. And those were very demoralizing. I can think of two. In Beijing, when I first got there, I was looking for the Mongolian embassy. This guy saw me come out of the subway and he was like, "Oh, can I help you out? I need to practice my English." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, that'd be great." His name was Rock. He was very helpful. He took me to the Mongolian embassy, showed me that, and then he actually took me back into the center of Beijing, helped me find a hostel. And then the next day, I went out to the Forbidden City, and with this memory of this guy in mind, having said yes and how helpful he'd been, um, someone approached me in a train station. They said, "Oh, I need to practice my English." It was basically exactly the same scenario. And I was like, "Yeah, sure." By that point, I was like you just said, if you say yes, you don't know what can happen. So I said yes and ended up getting scammed out of 60 Australian dollars. They took me to a cafe, and then we had this conversation. It was really weird. There was no one else in the cafe. I was thinking, okay, this is a bit odd. But I mean, I'm pretty naive. All the red flags are going in one ear and out the other. So at the end, the bill came, and it was for 120 Australian, and they said we'll split it. And so then we left, and it finally like kind of registered that I'd been scammed. So I ended up actually going back to the cafe, and it was all locked down. I banged on the door, and the woman came out, and I banged a bit more furiously, and she gave me my money back. Um, and then I found the scammers again in the train station and kind of confronted them. And I'll leave that story for the book. Um, and later, just before I met Sasha and Eleanor, actually, it was after I met them. So I got to the border and met them, and then unpacked and realized my iPad wasn't in my pack. And I was pretty good at packing things up, and always checking. Like I remember the last time I checked that I had my iPad, and I was okay. I'm 95% sure I didn't leave it in Bainolgi. But on the way up, I'd been flagged on the side of the road. I pulled into this little village, and this guy was like, "Do you want to come in for a cup of tea?" I said yes. So I went in, and he was really friendly. Gave me tea, gave me bread. His wife and his kids were there. He had a house. And it was just really heartwarming. It was raining and cold outside. I was freezing, and I said yes, and this guy taking me to this house. So I left and got up to the border, and I didn't have my iPad. And I was thinking, this guy's he must have taken it because I would have left it in my bag, and just not been paying attention or something. There wasn't really anywhere else it could be. So I rode back, and as I got there, he was leaving his house in his car, and I pulled the bike up in front of his car so he couldn't move it. And his wife was in the passenger seat, and she just had this look of absolute terror on her face. And I kind of knew at that point that he'd probably got the iPad. So yeah, I guess in some ways saying yes did lead to um, some sticky situations that were quite demoralizing at the time. But then in other ways, it led to some meeting some incredible people who gave me some incredible help. The other thing, though, that I was just thinking when you asked me that question was when I got back, my partner Danica said that in some ways it's kind of sad because a lot of what I did would be very difficult for a female in the same situation. So, for example, when the bike fell on me and I got out from under it, and then I walked and found this camp of guys that were sitting around a campfire with machetes. It's not something I thought about at the time, but um, that could have been a lot less safe for a woman or a woman traveling across Mongolia by herself and sleeping in rough in towns like I did. It adds a different element to it that um, would make it more tricky. So yeah, I guess I'm lucky in a lot of ways to have been able to do it.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm not saying it would be impossible for anybody, but it is something else to think about that I didn't have to think about. Uh, and I'm grateful for that. And I appreciate that. That for me, saying yes is easier than it is for a lot of people.
Right. And it sounds a lot different to be in your shoes than it would be to be in a woman's shoes trying to navigate through all of these countries. But even then, I mean, you've experienced all these challenging situations with confronting a thief, having a lot of your stuff stolen, the iPad, and then having to, kind of navigate through those nonetheless. And you mentioned one more thing, and we could save this for the book, but you also mentioned that you were held up at gunpoint during your trip. Are you able to kind of allude to that?
Yeah. So yeah, that was quite interesting. I was in Laos, and I was staying in this hotel that was really just like a concrete shell near the Plain of Jars. And I was in my room and came out and walked down to the lobby, and there were these two backpackers standing with their backs to me in the doorway. So I kind of walked up behind them, and one of them, they're both American, a girl and a guy, and he was about, oh, he must have been about 6'5", just this enormous dude. And they were standing there, and I came up behind them, and he kind of turned to me and said, "Could you go and get help? He's got a gun." I was like, "Oh, what?" I didn't know what they were talking about. So I kind of looked past them and saw this guy in the lobby, and he had a fedora. He was a Laotian guy. He had a fedora and like a big, like a Spider-Man logo spider tattooed across his chest. He was shirtless. And he had his hand behind his back. And I walked through the middle of the backpackers, and they were like, could you go and get help?" And this guy was yelling at me, telling me not to move. Uh, and then he was swearing off at the two Americans. But it was kind of weird because every time he'd swear at them, he would then look at me and say, "No, not you. I'm sorry." I'm like, "Hang on, what is going on here? This is really weird." So I kind of just put my hands out and like walked up to him because he seemed to not have much issue with me, although he didn't want me to leave. And I was just like, "Look, I just want to go and get dinner. I don't know what's going on. I'm just hungry. I'm going to go across the road. I'm going to get food. Like, I'm not here to bother you." Um, and he was like, "No, stay. You can't go." He was kind of yelling. And I just kind of said it a few times. And he was like, "Okay, fine." And he let me go. So I walked past him and looked behind, and he had his hand on the butt of a pistol that he tucked into the back of his pants. So I walked across the road to this restaurant and asked the waitress. I was like, "There's a guy across the road. He's holding up some people with this gun. Can someone come across and help us out, or can we call the police?" And she didn't really know what to do, but she pointed me to this table of three people that were sitting there, and I told them the same situation. One of them spoke English, and he said, "Oh, this is loud. The police can't do anything." And I was like, "Well, we got to do something because I can't just go back there by myself. I don't know how to solve this problem." So he's like, "Okay." So they came across with me, and they came in, and um, the introduction of new people into the room kind of diffused the tension with the guy that had the gun and the two Americans. Um, so we kind of got talking. The guy with the gun spoke English. Sorry, my phone is just going off there. And he was saying something like, "Oh, they came into my hotel and they left without paying and all this kind of stuff." And he was swearing and calling them long nose. And the three Laotian guys were talking to the hotel manager, I think they were trying to call the police or something. So the guy kept apologizing to me. So I was like, "Okay, if I can just get him out of the room, maybe it'll diffuse the situation a bit further." So I said to him, "Look, why don't we just step outside?" There was a glass door and a glass wall. I was like, "Let's just step outside, leave them here. They're not going anywhere. We can sort it out in a second." I was just kind of talking at him. Um, and he took his hand off his gun. He was like, "Okay, sure." So I kind of like put my hand on his shoulder and guided him outside. And then we were out the front. We were talking for ages, and he was pretty much just swearing off at the Americans and going off at them, and was quite irate. And I just agreed with him, and there's nothing else for me to do. I was just like, "Oh, that's terrible. That sounds so terrible." And in my head, I was just going, as long as you're out here angry and not in there angry, it doesn't really matter. Um, and yeah, he calmed down and left. And the story was that uh, the Americans got to his hotel and found that he didn't have any running water. So they just were like, "Hey, we're going to find a different hotel." So they left. And this guy, obviously a nut job, chased them. And his friend or something who worked at the hotel was chasing them as well and harassing them on a scooter and throwing bricks. So the American, who was this kid from Iowa, this huge guy, I guess he just snapped. He lifted the guy off the moped and just threw him on the ground. And that's when he went back and got the gun and chased them back to this hotel. So that was the story there. It ended up just diffusing. The guy left. The police came a few hours later. I went and had dinner, came back. The police were there. and they were trying to get the Americans out of their room, but they didn't want to leave, understandably, because they didn't know who was on the other side of the door. So I kind of helped them give a statement to the police. The policeman was just scrolling Facebook. And I don't know what ended up coming of it, but the Americans were like, we're just going to leave. We're going to go back to whatever town they'd just come from. So yeah, it all ended well. And I wasn't held up, for money or anything, which was lucky.
Mhm. Nonetheless, it's a crazy situation to be in, especially in a foreign country.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. It was kind of weird just to be like walking out for dinner, as I did every night, and then suddenly find myself in this argument with this guy. Definitely didn't need to be doing what he was doing, but yeah, it was interesting. I got a good story out of it.
Now, I kind of want to jump into a couple of quick questions that I gathered online from people. I saw them on Reddit, asked some friends for questions as well, and I kind of wanted to just shotgun these to you, just to kind of get your quick
Yeah, sure.
responses on these. So we'll just go ahead and jump into these. So the first question is, if you could do the trip again, what would you do differently?
What would I do differently? I would have brought less clothes. I probably would have um, allowed more time in Russia. Is probably my big regret. There's so much to see in Russia, and by that point, I was sort of out of time, running out of money. So I sort of skipped it. In hindsight, I would have spent a lot more time in Russia. I would have spent more time in Myanmar. Honestly, probably a bit more time overall. Although by the end of the 6 months, I was just about ready to get home. Um, that's about it, really. It's kind of hard to think back and think what I would do differently because I mean, I enjoyed it all.
Hmm.
In hindsight, I wouldn't have said yes to the people that wanted to scam me in the cafe. I wouldn't have said yes to the guy that stole my iPad. But those aren't things you can
Hindsight's
really regret.
2020, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, what was your biggest takeaway from the trip, and do you think that anything in your life prepared you for accomplishing the journey?
Um, no, I don't think anything prepared me. If I could do this, anybody can do this. It's just a matter of taking it one problem at a time. Um, because sometimes, problems, the scale of the task at hand, like crossing Mongolia, can seem like insurmountable. But if you just think, okay, what's the first problem? I need a coffee, and then you solve that problem, and the next problem comes up, which is the clutch, and then that gets solved, and the next problem is how to get there, and then nothing could have really prepared me for that because when you get there, the easiest way is just to keep solving problems. So that's what I mean when I say anybody can do it, as long as you
Hmm.
don't curl up in the fetal position. You can find a way. I did
Right.
keep risks to a minimum, so I didn't take like stupidly remote routes or anything like that, just so that help was always kind of nearby. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm unusual in the sense that I was somehow prepared for this more than other people would be. I'm like anybody. I was just a random uni student that decided to do this. And yeah, takeaways. The world is bigger and smaller in different ways to what I thought. Smaller in the sense that people are more similar than you think. Bigger in the sense that it's a very long way to go on a very slow motorcycle.
Now, what would you say was the single most difficult part of your travels?
Um, Single most difficult part, probably on the bike crossing Mongolia. When it fell on me, I was a few days in, and I think at that point I was emotionally quite low. It was quite draining riding on sand and constantly having to put my feet down. It felt like I was getting sledgehammered in the bottom of the foot. The roads are really corrugated, so if I was on a road, it wasn't tarmac; it was just a dirt road, but it was like really corrugated. I felt like I was sitting on a jackhammer, and hours of that were just really emotionally draining. Not physically draining so much as just tiring, you know.
Hmm.
And then the bike fell on me in the evening as it was getting dark, and I just kind of lay there and thought, like, oh, like this is just yeah, this is quite difficult. Um, Within a few hours, I'd find help, and I was back at an emotional high again. But there were times like that, I think, where I thought that this is tough. And from an emotional point, I just felt like I'd crashed. But that would only, I mean, it would last for an hour or two, and then it would get better.
Hmm.
But yeah, in the moment, if I'm thinking back to it, those are probably the worst.
Now, how expensive was the trip, and what was most of your money spent towards?
So 10K overall, roughly Australian. And the bulk of that was on the cruise, which was 2.5K from memory, and the bike was 3,000 or 3.5, I can't quite remember. And then all the additional stuff on the bike would have been another six or 700 Australian dollars. Uh, Getting it sorted out and getting like a jacket and a helmet. The helmet was quite expensive. Didn't waste any money on that. Um, and then crossing Russia was 600 Australian dollars because I was splitting fuel costs with Sasha. Um, and then yeah, the rest of the money must have just gone to sort of odds and ends, tickets into certain places and food obviously, but food and accommodations very very cheap in Asia, so it wouldn't have really gone to that.
Hmm.
There were people that I met that had 10 grand and were living off of that for like 4 or 5 years. So yeah, money goes a long way. This was quite expensive because I spent it on a bike and a cruise.
What was the most unexpected thing that you faced on the journey, whether it be cultural or otherwise?
That's a good question. Most unexpected thing I'd faced. Um, it was all unexpected, really. I don't know if there's any particular part of it that was any more or less expected. It was all very new and all very um, unexpected. I didn't expect the staying with Sasha and Eleanor and how helpful they would be, and essentially living with a family in Russia for as long as I did that week and driving across Russia. And that's unexpected in a good way. People had helped me until that point, and people had put a lot of time into helping me out, but no one had really gone above and beyond to the same extent. So if I had to think about it, I'd probably say that.
Hmm. Now, I know we were talking earlier about it all seems very similar despite going from border to border. You're traveling one border and you're 20 kilometers down the road the other. But at the end of the day, it all seems the same. But what would you say was the most unique cultural difference that you faced across all of the countries you traveled through, including, being in Switzerland and being in Australia?
Yeah. It's not so much that it was all the same. It was more just a much more gradual change than I think a border would lead you to believe. But yeah, when you ask me that immediately, the one thing that comes to mind in Southeast Asia, everyone honks their horns constantly, and it's like a "here I am" type message. It's not aggressive or anything. It's like, "I'm passing on the left, I'm passing on the right, honk honk." So the street noise is just it's really loud, and there's loads of horns. And then when I got the train to China, I got off the train and it was like silent. There was no one honking. People were just driving on the correct side of the road. They weren't swerving around. They weren't honking or anything. It was really quiet. And that was a big that was a big change. I was like, oh, this is nice. I could get used to this. Um, and then the other weird one was going from Mongolia to Russia because Mongolia um, has significantly less developed. The infrastructure is a lot poorer. And crossing into Siberia, it felt like I was in Europe. You know, road signs, bus stop, paved roads, pedestrian crossings, schools, road signs, like all that kind of stuff. Just the environment of the road itself was much more European, and it was a very sudden
Hmm.
change.
So, what would you say was the most interesting or coolest thing you saw on your trip? And what would you say was your favorite part of the trip?
The most interesting was staying with the reindeer herders. Yeah, just because it was quite a different way of life, I guess. Herding reindeer and your whole life is sort of dictated by the rhythm of moss, when the moss is there and when it isn't there. Um, so that was the most interesting part. Another interesting part that kind of comes to mind, I wouldn't say it was the most interesting, but just kind of hanging around Novosibirsk, like in the suburbs out at the university, we'd be driving around these suburbs that I grew up in the US. I grew up in Philadelphia, just outside Philly. And the suburbs around Novosibirsk, the wealthy ones around the university, looked exactly like where I grew up in Philadelphia, except it was Russia. That was really interesting. Just seeing that side of things, I guess, wasn't what I was expecting.
Wow. And that's kind of mind bending to kind of see the similarities between two different countries like that.
Yeah, it is a bit. And yeah, going to the university and seeing the student dorms and thinking, oh, that was me, a couple of years ago, um, looked very similar. Yeah, it was just a lot more familiar than I thought it would be,
Hmm.
considering it was in the middle of Siberia.
Now, what ultimately happened to the motorcycle by the end of the trip? And how did you navigate from Moscow all the way to Switzerland?
Oh yeah, so this is kind of the motorcycle story was kind of sad. So I rode the bike from Moscow back to Basel. It took me about a week and a bit, I think 10 days or so. And I was by that point I was pretty keen to get home, so I was just kind of powering through. Um, the bike when I got to Prague, the bike the I was came to stop at some traffic lights and the back brake stopped working. I was going, oh god, couldn't stop. I had to stop with the front brake. Anybody knows rides a bike will know that if you stop with the front, there's a risk of
Right.
going forward over the handlebars. So the back brake was a big deal. So I pulled over, and it's a bit difficult to explain verbally, but essentially a lever had there was a nut holding a lever in place that had come off. So I ended up, all I had was my roll of duct tape, and I had a bottle of Coke Zero, an empty bottle that I'd finished earlier. So I took the cap off the bottle of Coke Zero, punctured a small hole in it with my little pocket knife, and then put it on the where the nut used to be on the lever, and just duct taped it with about half a roll of duct tape, and thought, okay, well this won't work as a brake in the long term, but if I have to slam on my brake and come to a quick stop, this will hold for one. It will take 20 k's off my speed. That's all I need. That's about half as fast as I'm going anyway. So I rode the bike back. That was in Prague. I rode it to Basel, duct tape together like that. Sailed through a few red lights because I wasn't willing to stop with my front brake. Rode along the autobahn, and then got to Basel and I parked it. I rode straight to my dad's work because I was going to surprise my mum. She didn't know I was going to be back or when I was going to be back, so we were surprising her at a restaurant. So I rode to my dad's work and left it in the car park, and then got a tram to the restaurant, and then kind of left the bike there. I went home. I didn't really think about it, and to be honest, it was a problem that I just couldn't really solve. It. I couldn't move it to a recycling depot because the back brake was broken. I didn't want to. I couldn't sell it because it was too crap. Um, so I went back to get it about 2 weeks later from the car park, and it just vanished. And I think it must have been towed um, by the company or something like that. And I was thinking, okay, well, if someone wants to find me and like charge me some money for it, then I'm sure they will. But when I crossed into Switzerland, they didn't know how to fill out all the forms because all the forms are in Mongolian script and Cyrillic, like Russian alphabet. So they, even if they were trying to find the owner, they probably couldn't have matched the forms up to me, and it was probably all just bureaucratically complicated. So I don't know. I don't know what happened to it. I said this in the book and on Reddit, but I like to think someone got on it and rode him back to Mongolia, and he was just leaking oils back on those Siberian highways and back across Mongolia.
Wow. That's a crazy story at the very end. But nonetheless, how long did it take you to ultimately traverse from Australia to Basel total?
Um, so the cruise was in February, and then I got back at the beginning of just the end of June. So it was, um, although I was sort of on the road from the beginning of January, from Singapore to Basel was, what's that, February, March, April, May, June, 4 months. I was on the bike for about last 6 weeks. I bought the bike in mid-May and then was on it for 6 weeks. 4 of those weeks were in Mongolia, or 3 of those weeks, and then a couple of weeks in Russia, and then the last bit, Moscow to Basel, I just powered through basically. That just took a week or 10 days or something.
Hmm.
So yeah, 6 months all up, I'd say.
It's a fair amount of time to travel across a couple of continents from.
No, I didn't spend like each country in Southeast Asia. I was there for about 2 weeks. Like I didn't spend long enough to get to know it, or um, as well as I could have, or should have in some ways. But I had the budget for 6 months. I had the time for 6 months.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, that was the window I got, and I wanted to spend as much time in Mongolia as I could. So kind of rushed through a lot of it, but could have done it a lot faster, I suppose, if I was just to go straight there single-mindedly. I did a lot of loops in Southeast Asia.
Now, you're traveling across Mongolia, large stretches of land in which there's far and few towns in between one another. How did you manage to handle gas in such a
Oh yeah,
situation?
this came up on Reddit. So I bought a jerry can. The bike had about 200 in the tank, and it had about a reserve tank that could take me an extra 50. I bought a jerry can in Ulaanbaatar and filled that with gas as well. So that added, or maybe I'm getting my maths mixed up. Maybe the tank had 150 and then the jerry can had 50. Either way, between the bike and the jerry can, I had about 300 all up. So that wasn't a problem until sort of the western part of Mongolia, the middle western part of the country, just north of the Gobi, where there was up to 300 Ks between gas stations. And I knew that because I had a map on me and people could give me rough distances. And I didn't have any room, like I couldn't ride without any margin for error because I got lost on a couple of occasions. One occasion I got lost and it was a whole morning. It was probably a 20 or 30 kilometer detour. So I couldn't afford to not have spare gas just because of the risk of me making a mistake. So I stopped in this town and I stopped at the gas station, the last one before this 300K stretch. Um, and remembering I can't count how far I've gone because the odometer's broken. I don't have a fuel gauge on the bike, so I don't know how full the tank is or anything. It was all very just like trying to remember, I guess, how far I'd come and how much gas I was likely to have left. So I was trying to ask this guy if he had any spare jerry cans, and he was shaking his head and said no. And then I was kind of stuck and didn't really know what to do. And he came out with a bottle of Sprite and kind of like mimed if you fill the Sprite bottle, and he was like kind of pinching the plastic, and the plastic's quite thick, it would hold the gas. So I did, it was a 2 liter Sprite bottle. So I bought that, emptied the Sprite out, filled that with gas. So I had a Sprite bottle, jerry can, the bike, and then I emptied the main tank, the reserve tank, the jerry can, the Sprite bottle, and then got to a gas station and filled it all back up. And then after that, there was never a time after that where I was going more than 300K between gas stations. Um, it was always less than that. So I was within my margin of error that was comfortable. Never had a problem with gas after that. But yeah, there was a few times where I forgot to count how far I'd gone or forgot to keep track of the kilometers, and the bike would just come to a stop and I'd have to get off and empty the can into it or something like that. So yeah, it was a problem, but it wasn't insurmountable.
And the last question, you're traveling through a lot of desolate and remote regions, all the way from Southeast Asia to Basel, Switzerland. Did you find it at times to be very lonely, or were you kind of amused by music or podcasts while you're kind of camping out in the middle of Mongolia? Was it kind of challenging to keep yourself sane while by yourself?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I'm generally okay spending time by myself, but yeah, there was times in Mongolia it was just I'd go all day without speaking or hearing another human voice. So I'd lie in my tent at night. And I don't know if all your listeners are aware, the Hamish and Andy Show podcast is very popular in Australia. I would put them on, and it'd be the first time that I'd heard anybody all day. So they kind of kept me sane. It was a reminder of home, I guess, in some senses. It was quite difficult on the bike, was probably when it was most pronounced because I couldn't put headphones on in the bike. I had these like Apple headphones, but wearing them under the helmet, they're pressing on my ears, and after about half an hour, it was too painful, and I couldn't really hear anything anyway over the roar of the bike and the wind. So the days on the bike, 16-hour days, just kind of alone with myself in a helmet. Like I'd put the helmet on the morning and just go, "Oh God, you again? How boring." And I'd be trying to like ride across, just going, keeping myself for company. I'm not a very interesting person to spend time with by myself in a motorcycle helmet. So in Europe, I ended up reading road signs in different accents. I mean, all kinds of things just to keep myself normal. To be honest, you asked me if did I keep myself sane? Probably not. It's probably a bit weird when I got home.
Well, Ewan, it's been a crazy story. Your trip, your travels, obviously were fascinating. A lot of very interesting stories along the way. But before we go, you also have a short memoir out called Overland. Could you take a moment to briefly talk about that for the viewers?
Yeah, sure. So on the trip, I kept a blog for the benefit of family and friends. Every week or so, I would add a new post. They're always quite long, a few thousand words. I'd spend a morning putting them together, and people were saying I should, write it down into a book before you forget because memory fades over time. So I got back, and a couple of months passed, and I realized that all the blog posts together were about 40 or 50,000 words. And I thought I could add another 20 or 30 onto this, and it would be a book. And I was feeling my memory kind of fading a little bit. There were times, things that I was losing track of, and I thought I'd like to get this all down before it all kind of fades and becomes a bit more blurred. And I'm glad I did because, well, now that I can read the book and remember things that I might not have otherwise remembered, but also it's made my memory a bit more clear, just the act of writing it all out. So yeah, the book is a memoir. It's different to the blog post. It isn't just a collection of blog posts. I ended up sort of really writing it as a memoir, and it's Mostly lighthearted. I tried to just keep it sort of as factual as possible without um, diverting too much here and there. There's a few times I tell some funny anecdotes or interesting facts that I found along the way about this or that or the other. And then stories in there that I didn't tell on the blog and haven't told many people that are now in the book. So yeah, it was mostly for my own benefit and for my family and friends. And then I've put it on Amazon and obviously got quite a lot of traction on Reddit. So yeah, I'm glad people are interested. I'm glad to have it out there.
Now, if someone's interested in reading your memoir on their mobile device, I know you mentioned that it's on Amazon, but if anybody's interested in reading it on their e-reader, where can they find it?
So they can find it all over. It's on Amazon, it's on iBooks, it's on Barnes and Noble, Angus and Robertson, or digital copies. There's a paperback copy that you can also get on Amazon, and it's a free promo, I think, until the 24th of August. So you can get it for free on whatever platform you use to read your ebooks, whether that's Kindle, whether that's an iPhone, whether you want a paperback copy. You can't get those for free, I'm afraid. But yeah, digital copy's free till the 24th, Amazon and a whole lot of different places. There's a universal book link that can be found in the Reddit thread. Uh, it's just bookstoread.com/overland.
Well, Ewan, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down, talk through your story, and give the listeners a fascinating look at your trip from Australia to Basel, Switzerland. So, again, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Tasha. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.